Morning, everyone. We're going to get started now. Thank you for your participation today in the New York State Workers' Compensation Board Systems Modernization WebEx. We're going to be on the call for about an hour, so we're going to go through a brief presentation, and then we'll hopefully get to your questions. If you want to submit those in the chat feature, you can send them directly to the host. The agenda for today is we're going to go around and introduce the team. We're going to give you some guidelines for the WebEx. We're going to discuss the summary of changes from the first release of the RFP from December of 2017. We have a few questions that we're going to address that were sent in advance, and then we're going to turn it over and allow you folks to put some questions in the chat feature, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Okay, so we're going to introduce the team now. I'm going to go ahead and let Steve Smith start.
Steve Smith, Deputy Executive Director with the board.
Melissa Stazenko, I'm the Assistant Director of Finance at the board.
Tanya Sanderson, I'm the primary contact for the RFP.
I'm Courtney Souza, I'm the alternate contact for the RFP. I'm Valerie Vanderwall, I'm Associate Attorney for the board.
I'm Patrick Sato, I'm Senior Developer for ITS.
Tim Purcell, BIS Project Director.
Tina Jones, Director of Operations.
Byron Gear, Director of Business Solutions for WCB.
Okay, just a few guidelines and housekeeping issues. As I said, we're going to try to address as many of the questions that we received prior to the WebEx. And the way we, decided which questions we could really address in the time frame, we're going to try to stick really to ones that were common to more than one vendor or are just conceptual questions, and ones that are not really overly technical. That being said, we are going to respond to all the questions presented both today and, that we receive as part of the regular RFP process, and we will be providing written answers to those by 10/22. The phone lines are muted, but the chat feature is available to allow you to submit questions. And as I mentioned before, please submit those questions to the host. And also just so that you know, the WebEx is being recorded. Okay, so just a couple of things before we get into the summary of changes that we made to the RFP. As most of you know, on December 19th, 2017, we issued the original RFP for the Systems Mod project. After the evaluation process concluded, the board elected not to award a contract at that time. We revisited many of the issues that the vendors raised and questions about the last RFP, and we just regrouped internally, and we made some significant changes to both the technology approach and some of the business requirements. And we rescoped the RFP, and what we've put out is, what we think is a really good document that's going to meet the board's needs. And one of our reasons for doing this WebEx today is because we really wanted to encourage maximum participation in this procurement and get a really robust bidder pool. So we hope that that will be an end result of this. So moving into the summary of changes since the last RFP, with regard to the IAIABC, we removed the medical EDI requirements. With regard to claims EDI 3.1, we revised the business requirement to require flat file data transfer as currently used by WCB for IAIABC claims EDI. With regard to the data warehouse, we revised the requirements to integrate the existing data warehouse into the system. We did a lot of revision to the vendor staffing model and added some flexibility in to allow for off-site work on the project where defined. And obviously, please refer to the RFP for further details on what that looks like. In regards to the design and application architecture, the technology requirements were significantly revised. The on-prem requirements were relaxed. Requirements were added for portability, containerization, DevOps, and macro, mini, and micro services. With regards to contract language, there were some some questions about this one in the last round of the RFP, and we removed the performance bond and letter of credit requirement. And also, the new document is now supportive of the agile and iterative development methodology. We added some flexibility in the payment milestones during the build and implementation phases. Okay, so now we're going to move into the Q&A section. We did receive a few questions that ahead of time that we're going to address now. Different team members are going to address those, and if we have anything come through in the chat, we'll go ahead and try to get to those as we can. So question one that we got, states generally can purchase software much less expensively than a private contractor. Is the purpose of the additional software tab to understand rough estimates for software, or will vendors be responsible for purchasing software? The answer to that question is the state plans to purchase software and hardware off of state contract when available. The reason that we asked for these is that it will really assist us with budgeting for this category of expense. Byron, you want to take question two?
Sure. Question was, please describe the existing FileNet environment. Where does the production instance reside? Who maintains it? And what other systems have access to it? So the FileNet environment is currently integrated FileNet IS. We are moving to FileNet P8 in the next couple of months, so we'll talk specifically about FileNet P8. It resides in our CNSD data center at SUNY Albany, and we'll have disaster recovery in Utica. ITS maintains it, maintains all the services that surround it and integration points with it. All of our documentation, whether it either comes in paper form to a scanning vendor or is electronically generated, flows into our FileNet P8 system. And our applications that need to show the documentation, the scanned images, are integrated and are able to call into this FileNet P8 environment and pull up the images, namely CIS and eCase.
Okay, thank you. Question three. Tanya, can I take that?
Okay, so the question is, please clarify that the 36% requirement for MBE, WBE, SDVOB is inclusive only of the labor total, deliverable and annual maintenance support, not software costs. The 36% requirement, 30% for MWBE and 6% for the SDVOB, is for the resulting contract of this RFP. For example, if the contract total, is $50 million, you would have to have $15 million allocated for MWBE subcontracting opportunities and $3 million for the SDVOB subcontracting opportunities. And if these cannot be met, the vendor would have to submit a waiver, which would eventually have to go to the ESD office for approval. So, you'd have to prove that you made a good faith effort. You couldn't find the vendors to do the supporting subcontracting opportunities and submit the waiver and then get approval for that. Question number 4, will you be providing a list of New York State MWBE companies who are interested in being a subcontractor to prime vendors? And yes, we will be doing that. The intents to bid are due to the board no later than 2 p.m. on October 8th. So what we'll do is on probably Tuesday the 9th, we will put a link on our website, which will be available by COB on Tuesday, and that'll have a list of the prime contractors who submitted an intent to bid and a list of the MWBE and the SDVOB vendors. And in addition to that, you'll be getting an email from the contracts inbox that has a link to that, the website, to anyone who submitted an intent to bid. And question 5, can companies from outside the USA apply for this? Yes, vendors can, companies that are outside the U.S. However, as part of the RFP, one of the minimum qualifications is that the vendor must be authorized to do business in New York State. And then none of the work can be performed outside of the U.S. It has to be done here in the United States of America. And our last question, is the vendor permitted from responding to only portions of the RFP, or is this RFP an all or nothing bid? And for a proposal to be responsive, it must address all RFP requirements. So, you know, you can't just submit an RFP for a section of the proposal. You have to submit everything.
Okay. Doesn't look like we have a lot of questions coming through the chat, so I guess we'll give people a minute or two to ask any questions that you might have before we conclude. Okay, we're getting a few questions, so let's see. What is the first one here? Will we be getting written responses to the questions just answered? Yes, we will be providing answers to the questions that have been asked on the WebEx and anything that comes through during the regular Q&A period that's described in the RFP process.
Okay, and then do subcontractors need to file an intent to bid, or only the prime vendors? Only the prime vendors need to submit the intent to bid. And I also want to just go back to the question about the 36% on the MWB and just clarify that if software is purchased through the vendor and that software is purchased from an MWBE provider, then that would count towards your 36%. I mean, the intent is that we're going to procure the software off of a state contract, but in the event that it is procured through the vendor, then that would be applicable to the 36% MWBE requirement if it were purchased through an MWBE provider.
Okay, there was a question asked about whether the funding is approved for the project, and the answer to that is yes, it has been.
So we have a question here about, can the solution be on-prem or cloud or hybrid? I guess the answer is yes. The point to the requirements that were added around containerization and portability is that the solution will be abstracted from any particular infrastructure and really could be housed anywhere. From our perspective at this point, we believe if the solution is bid properly using those DevOps and containerization microservices requirements, that it can be put anywhere, including within CNSC or in a private cloud provider.
Okay, there's a question here. How should we notify you of our intention to act as an MBE subcontractor to potential primes? What you would do is, in the RFP, I believe it's attachment 2, is you would submit that intent to bid, and there's a section on there where you would just check off that you're submitting this intent to bid because you're interested in being an MWBE subcontractor. So you would just check that box and submit it to the WCB contracts email.
Okay, we have a question about how the cost is considered in the RFP. And pursuant to the document, we have a split between technical and cost of 70% for technical and 30% for cost. And just as a follow-up to that, in the last release of the RFP, it was 60% technical and 40% cost.
So we have a question here. Can the vendor propose to use proprietary tool and product built, as well as a question down below, does the solution need to be a .NET or Java only? So I think the requirements clearly state that the solution must be a custom developed C#.NET solution. So we have a question of when the RFP refers to a custom developed system, does that mean ground up development, or can it be a COT solution with customization? It cannot be a COT solution with customization. It means to be a custom developed C#.NET application.
We have a question about, can we email the recorded webinar or will there be a link to it? We'll try to put a link up on our website within the next couple of days.
Okay, so there's some questions regarding MBEs, WBEs, and SDVOBs. If you want to be listed as an MWBE vendor and SDVOB vendor for this RFP as a subcontractor, just, I think I stated earlier, submit attachment 2, which is the notice of intent to bid. There's a section on there that instructs you just to check if you're an MWBE vendor or an SDVOB and you're interested in subcontracting opportunities, and just submit that. I believe the due date for that is October 8th. Just submit that to the WCB contracts email, and we will make sure that you're on the list of the vendors.
We have a couple of questions about offshore or not. It was mentioned all work has to be performed in the U.S. Are you open to a product that is developed internationally where the final solution is hosted in the U.S. And services are provided with staff in the U.S.? It mentions tools to build proposed solutions, and these teams work from our offshore locations. So the solution has to be custom developed, as we said, and that development, that customized development, needs to occur by staff that, when they're doing the development, are located physically within the United States.
We have a question about, is there a schedule constraint that is either legislatively mandated due to funding reasons or due to technology or business imposed constraints? There is not any legislative mandate that requires us to complete the project within a certain amount of time. As you know from the RFP, the projected time frame of the contract is 3 years with 2 one-year potential extensions.
Okay, so we have another question. If MWBE firms have consultants working at WCB through the HBITS contracts, are those MWBE firms acceptable as subcontractors to prime bidders on this RFP? The answer is yes, as you know, as long as the staff that's working at the WCB is not working on that as part of the subcontractor, but the firm can definitely submit an intent to bid. Okay, we have a statement here saying Exhibit 2 was admitted from the RFP. There was no Exhibit 2 that was as part of the RFP. I believe it's attachment 2. If you're talking about the intent to bid, it's attachment 2. Is it mandatory for submitting the intent to bid? It's not mandatory, but we would, if you're an MWBE vendor, we're not going to know if you're interested in any subcontracting opportunities. So if you're interested in participating, I would highly suggest you submit an intent to bid.
We have a question about, could the vendor leverage existing hardware software licenses that New York State has? The answer is yes, quite simply.
Assuming they're consistent with the other requirements of the RFP.
Hi, we have a question about whether or not any companies supported the development of the RFP, and NISTEC and Gartner did play roles in the development of the RFP, and both of those companies are precluded from bidding on this procurement. We have a question about whether or not WCB can disclose the MBE, WBE they're working with WCB. Can prime vendor include MBE, WBE who does not submit intent at a later date? Well, we're not going to give a list of the current MWBE, WBE firms that we currently have performing work for us. What we're going to do is provide a list of the WBE, MBE firms that submit intent to bid so that people can see who's interested. However, if a MBE, WBE does not submit an intent to bid, you can still work with them as a prime vendor. It's just, you know, the ones that submit the intent to bid, they're going to be on a list so that it helps with facilitating partnerships. But you don't have to, I mean, you can use vendors that don't submit an intent to bid as subcontractors for MWBE, WBE purposes.
We have a question about would the WCV accept a transfer solution? If whoever asked that question, if you could just try to clarify that for us in the chat, because we're not exactly sure what you're getting at there. The next question that we have is, can vendors submit additional questions, and what is the deadline for submitting those? As I mentioned earlier, all of the questions asked today will be addressed in writing, and we will accept additional questions right up until the deadline specified in the RFP.
I think it's October 8th.
October 8th.
I think the deadline's October
Okay.
8th, but please refer to the RFP for the official deadline.
Yeah, and then we'll respond to all those questions by 10/22.
So we have another question about system development. The solution needs to be a custom-built solution that meets the board's requirements.
Okay, so it looks like we've come to the end of the questions that we have right now. So I wanted to just quick touch on one of the issues that came up under the last RFP. We did make some changes to the Appendix C terms and conditions. As stated earlier, we removed the performance bond letter of credit requirement. We also took out some other requirements, for example, the most favorable terms requirements, things that people raised some issues with in the feedback that we got. I just wanted to point out that Appendix C terms and conditions are the state's kind of standard terms and conditions. The contract will incorporate most of those in a substantially similar manner. However, if there are particular terms and conditions contained in Appendix C that you can't agree to in the format that they're in now, you can propose alternative language using the extraneous terms template. So we just don't want people not to bid because there's like a provision in Appendix C that they can't agree with. You can propose an alternative, language. It doesn't mean that the state will be able to agree to the alternative language proposed, but at least it's a negotiating point. If a vendor who has proposed extraneous terms is awarded the contract, that'll all be flushed out during contract negotiations. If the state and the vendor can't reach agreement, then the state will go to the next highest scoring bidder. But we just don't want people not bidding because there's one term or you know, a couple of terms and conditions that they feel like they can't agree to in the current format.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have, and we just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. We look forward to receiving your proposal, and if you have additional questions, please do submit them to the contact person for the procurement, who's Tanya Sanderson, and we look forward to receiving your proposal by December 17th. Thank you.